Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series. I'm Stacy McKenna, and I will be moderating this discussion. Today, we have our Islamism and Politics Coordinator, Mr. Benjamin Baird, here to speak on Islamism in American politics, the 2020 elections. Mr. Baird will speak for roughly 5 to 10 minutes on the topic, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to submit a question at any time. We have many participants on this webinar, so I apologize in advance if we do not get to yours today. And now I am happy to turn the discussion over to Mr. Benjamin Baird.
Thank you, Stacy. Yes, so the topic today is Islamist political organizing in the 2020 elections. Islamists have become incredibly organized in recent years, especially since the 2016 elections, when they saw President Donald Trump's policies, especially when you look at immigration and foreign policy, as a direct challenge to their agenda. Now, Islamists many years ago used to, at least a small minority, used to look at voting within America's democratic institutions as problematic, as something to be avoided, the corrupt Western system that was part of their anti-Westernism. Today, however, we're seeing the exact opposite, where Islamists are referring to democratic participation as somewhat of a religious obligation, where they must get involved if they want to be good Muslims. Now, it's important, very briefly, to point out that Islamists are a minority among Muslim Americans, essentially. They make up a small part. They believe in a theocratic vision for America. They believe that the religion should dominate all facets of life, the social, the political. And they tend to dominate the political sphere for several reasons. Secular and moderate Muslims don't tend to be as politically active as Islamists. So many Muslims tend to look towards Islamists when it comes to political issues. So we're seeing Islamists active on several fronts. For instance, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is an unindicted co-conspirator in the nation's largest terrorism finance trial. They've been blacklisted by several government agencies. CAIR has started an election strategy which calls for raising $1.4 million to train 200 Muslim candidates, which essentially consists of political grooming. They want to groom Muslim candidates to push their agenda. And then they also want to increase Muslim registration and voter turnout by 20%. Muslims are already voting at slightly above the nation's average, but they want to increase that to somewhere up around 90%. Muslims tend to vote overwhelmingly Democrat. You have 3/4 of Muslims voting Democrats, the other quarter voting Republican or independent. So they want to take that voting block and put it into a cohesive, solid Muslim front that they plan on using in several ways. One of these ways is to push an agenda. Another part of their plan is to come up with a policy platform for all Muslims, which of course looks at Muslims as sort of a monolith. But what do Islamists want out of a voting platform? Number one, they want to demonize Israel, of course. They also want to use identity politics as sort of the political currency to push all their other issues of importance. Of course, they also look at a number of progressive issues that they sort of put an Islamist spin on, which again has to do with identity politics. And CAIR isn't alone, of course, in this organizing. They're also joined by organizations such as MGAGE, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and many other organizations which have joined them on this front. The MGAGE, for instance, has put $1 million towards trying to increase voter turnout among Muslims. And then there's another front, which we're just seeing, which sees Muslim organizations which are tied to foreign interests become politically active. This includes groups like the Turkish Heritage Organization or the National Iranian American Council. These groups actually support foreign interests. And what we're seeing from them is they're organizing, they're putting out, for instance, candidate scorecards that evaluate candidates based on how well they support a foreign regime. For instance, NIAC, the Iranian group, will evaluate candidates based on how well they support the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, or whether or not they've stood up against sanctions, whether or not they want to take away the president's war powers. And so they sort of communicate all of these back to their voter base and attempt to get them to vote in a certain way. We're also seeing this from the Turkish Heritage Organization, which was a group that was founded to appear to be a civil society organization, but in fact, emails show that this was a very deliberate plan to infiltrate American politics. Finally, I think it's worth talking about the presidential election, the upcoming 2020 election. You're seeing Islamist support, by and large, Bernie Sanders. They support him for several reasons, some of the aforementioned reasons, but Bernie Sanders, for instance, has talked about taking foreign aid away from Israel or making it dependent upon how they interact with Hamas, which essentially runs Gaza. And they, in addition, they support Bernie Sanders because of his socialism. For instance, you're seeing that many Muslims are supporting Islamists. Many Islamists are supporting Bernie Sanders because of his socialist ideals. There's theological backing for this. For instance, you'll see that zakat, the way of the Muslim tithing, they look at within a purely socialist lens. So this is what we're seeing from Islamists ahead of the 2020 elections, and they've been very active on several fronts.
Thank you so much for enlightening us all. We have quite a few questions coming in. First one is, can, should, and how can anti-sedition laws best be applied to Islamist participation in American elections?
Sure. So anti-sedition laws. I know that, for instance, there was talk many years ago of there were laws on the books that looked at outlawing the Communist Party, for instance. There are ways, I think, to reform bills. Now, that law never went into action, of course. It was challenged at the Supreme Court. But I think there are ways of using something like that to tie Islamist organizations to their sort of foreign ideological roots, whether that might be the Muslim Brotherhood, or in the case of groups like the Islamic Circle of North America, that might be Jamaat-e-Islami. But in either case, I think once you can make that connection to foreign groups which are tied to terrorist organizations, I think that you can use anti-sedition laws to outlaw some of these organizations. Now, not all of them are created equal. I don't think that the right answer is to make a blanket law that makes any Islamist organization tied to the Muslim Brotherhood illegal in the United States. But we certainly need to look at evaluating these organizations one at a time to determine how close and how overt these connections are, and thinking about using anti-sedition laws to outlaw them. Yes.
Thank you. We have another one here. How do we counter the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel efforts of the Islamists in America?
Well, that's a great question. You have to do so, I think, on many fronts. I think you need to point out that that this isn't anti-Israel policies that they're pushing. This is anti-Semitism in another form. They're simply pushing policies that are anti-Semitic at their core. You need only look at the statements that these groups make the clerics that they support, and of course their overseas connections to terrorist groups, to know that they are not anti-Israel, they are anti-Semitic. So I think communicating this to lawmakers is very, very important. You know, and that's the challenge, is many Islamists can be confused with progressives, you know, progressives wearing a hijab in the case of lawmakers like Ilhan Omar. But we need to distinguish them from the Progressive Party, I think, from the Democratic Party, and show that this is a difference. These are fringe policies that they're pushing. And yeah, I think we need to make that clear to lawmakers and the public.
Great. Are there other organizations or think tanks that are exploring this area of political activity?
Yeah, there most definitely are. The Center for Security Policy has been working at the state and federal level for many years, but to be honest, there isn't much of a push. Many people who take on Islamism take it on on a social level, you know, keeping Islamism out of schools, but Islamism is inherently political. It is theocratic. It seeks to replace America's democratic institutions with Islamic law. So therefore, you know, we need to look at this as a purely political challenge. And until we do so, you know, Islamists are going to continue to be legitimized. And you know, I think that there are other organizations looking at this, but the Middle East Forum, I think, is one of the few organizations out there taking on Islamism at the local and state level through several initiatives. For instance, the Counter-Islamist Grid uses activists in several states to take on Islamism at the local level. And of course, the Islamism in Politics project also tends to emphasize quite a bit at the state level, especially when it comes to Muslim advocacy days at state legislatures across the country. These are lobbying efforts by Islamists to work at the state level to get state lawmakers to back their agenda. You know, many Americans ignore state government, and I think Islamists have sort of fallen into this niche and said, hey, we're going to take advantage of every level of government that we can. And they've been highly successful at this in state capitals across the country. So, you know, there are other think tanks working on this, but there's not enough.
Thank you. So you mentioned that 200 Muslim candidates in the 2020 elections. What's the strata between these candidates? How many at the local, state, and national levels are there?
Sure. Most of these are at the state and local level. And again, that comes from Islamists really wanting to fill that gap. And, you know, they are at the state level right now, but I like to look at this as the beginning of a long evolution. You know, right now, Islamists are grooming candidates to run in local elections, but in the future, these candidates are going to gain experience, they're going to gain political clout, and we're going to see in the next decade or so, them increasingly take on more important federal judgeships, more important elections across the country. So yeah, the vast majority of these are local candidates. We saw this, for instance, with Abrar Omayesh, who ran for the Fairfax County School Board in 2019. These are school board commissions. These are board of elections. These are commissions. These are city council seats. There's even county judgeships that you're seeing Islamists run in. So they're becoming increasingly active, and they're starting at the local level, but I think we'll see that change over time.
Thank you. So a listener posits that a long-term key to solving this issue is decoupling Islamists from progressive causes and exposing Islamism's retrograde core. What opposes those same causes, and how do we do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is a very great point, that we do need to separate Islamists from the Progressive Party. I think in many cases, this isn't always an honest alliance from Islamists. You have Ibrahim Samira, who pointed to the Prophet Muhammad when he said Muhammad made alliances with his enemies all the time when it was politically expedient. So we need to point out to progressives that, look, in many cases, this is political expediency. This is not about them truly believing in your progressive cause. They may believe in many of the foreign policy issues that that progressives push, but at their core, when it comes to issues like gay marriage, when it comes to abortion, Islamists aren't on the same side in many cases as progressives. And I think pointing this out and making it clear, and then finding conservatives to ally with Muslims, with non-Islamist Muslims, is a way to sort of fracture that relationship. And also, we need to sort of highlight the differences among Islamists. There are Islamists fighting all the time about what is right for the future of Muslims in America. And we're increasingly seeing many Islamists reject progressives, and for the reasons that I stated. And I think we also need to highlight those divisions in order to sort of extricate Islamists from the progressive movement.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we have one last question. Can you please discuss a little further how to strategize countering these efforts without being labeled or targeted as being anti-Islamic?
That's a very good question. Well, I think we need to definitely distinguish between Islamists and Muslims. I think that's always important to make that clear. Whenever I speak to lawmakers, whenever I speak to activists, I always make that clear from the very beginning. You need to define that this is an Islamist problem, not a Muslim problem. We need to not ignore state and local issues. This is nationwide. Islamists are in every community. It's a multi-front effort. And I think that making it incredibly clear that we side with Muslims, with the moderate Muslim majority, that is ultimately the way to win this battle.
Thank you so much for your time in discussing all this today. We have come to the close of our webinar. There will be a short survey to fill out at the end to better help us serve you going forward. We'll also be sending out an invitation to our upcoming events, including a webinar on Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern with our Islamist Watch Director, Mr. Sam Westrop, our weekly Israel Insider webinar series with Ashley Perry, and a webinar on Friday on uncovering terror funding and foreign aid, the Islamic Relief Agency scandal. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.